Now, from Robert Freeman, from commondreams.org, the article, Obama was used and is now used up. I'll quote, Barack Obama was used, of course. He knew he was being used when he made the deal. But what he didn't know was how quickly he would be used up. Now he has to face 2 years of humiliation knowing that he betrayed the people and the country he claimed to champion, and knowing that everyone else knows it as well, but also knowing that he's gotten what's coming to him. Obama made a deal to get the job done in the first place. The ideal was that he would carry on with Bush's bailout of the banks, with Bush's 2 wars, with Bush's suppression of civil liberties, that he wouldn't prosecute or even investigate any of the enormous fraud that had brought down the country, or the lies that had railroaded it into war. Even before he took office, he began fulfilling his end of the bargain. He appointed Larry Summers, head of the National Economic Council. It was Summers, more than any other person, who was responsible for dismantling the Glass-Steagall regulations that had acted as a firebreak against banks looting the country since the Great Depression. Summers had made millions consulting for hedge funds before taking office. Obama appointed Timothy Geithner, Secretary of the Treasury. Geithner had been head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, another central actor in the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, do no evil that passed for financial oversight in the Bush administration. He had been a major architect under Bush of the financial bailout that passed trillions of dollars to his former banking cohorts on the pretext of saving the system. Obama reappointed Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Before becoming federal chairman, Bernanke had been Bush's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Together with Geithner, Bernanke is the person most responsible for the collapse, the one person who could have slowed the asset bubble while it was still possible. He had been at the helm of the Federal Reserve since February 2006 and a member of its board for many years before that. Obama reappointed Robert Gates, Bush's Secretary of Defense, signaling that there would be profitable, continued wars, gulags, and other military expressions of empire. And then, of course, he quickly tripled the number of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, even without a coherent strategy or even statement of goals. He put together the stimulus package, $787 billion, when reputable economists were screaming that the collapse in demand from the Great Recession was at least 4 times that amount. Then, in an attempt to appease the Republicans, he made 1/3 of it business tax cuts, despite the notorious ineffectiveness of such policies in generating jobs. When states cut back their payrolls and spending in the slump, it effectively neutralized the impact of Obama's program. Yet he never seriously attempted to get more. And finally, he proposed no jobs program to employ the 7 million people who had lost their jobs. No infrastructure program to repair the failing roads, bridges, tunnels, water, and sewage systems in the country. No anti-foreclosure program was a joke. Some 3 million homes will go into foreclosure this year alone, while 1 in 4 mortgages are underwater. The share of equity that middle-class Americans own in their homes is now lower than it was before World War II. And now the conspicuous, embarrassing truth is that he's not needed anymore, except as a tilled-up dummy sustaining the illusion of democracy. And you can see why. The rich owners of the country who put him into office in the certainty that he would be a smooth liar, able to sell the masses on the empty opiates of hope and change, they certainly don't need him anymore. And that's it. Your thoughts on this, please?
Pretty good story, pretty good article. I think we have to look at Obama as a brand. That's how he functioned. In the same way that a few years ago, Benetton and Calvin Klein had people of color and HIV-positive models to give their products an edge and associate their products with risque sort of style. And that's what Obama was for the corporate class, for the corporate state, with even sort of perhaps a faint peel of eroticism. And it's not, and it's for that reason that Obama won Advertising Age's top annual award, Marketer of the Year, right before he assumed office. The professionals knew precisely how he had been used and what he had done. But he was, and as the article points out, Obama was certainly complicitous in this. He's not a stupid man. He understands where the sources of power are, and he served those sources, and they have very much discarded him. They don't need him anymore. That's right.
Are you surprised at how much myth occurs in the mainstream media of how they literally rewrite history? They're trying to tell us now that Bill Clinton was a good Democrat and a good liberal, and then after he lost most of Congress, he then went to the center, and we want everyone now to go to center. Bill Clinton was center-right all along. And then he went even further. That's when he started giving up the Glass-Steagall Act and the Commodity Future Trading Act and gutting the welfare, creating that welfare reform that made it impossible for legitimately poor people to survive, and the deforestation and all the other things. Give us your idea of the difference between Clinton and Obama, the Democrats then and the liberal class, and the Democrats and liberal class now.
Well, I think Obama is the logical extension of the Democratic Party under the Clintons. Clinton understood that if he served corporate interests, he could get corporate money. It was a conscious decision, so that by the 1990s, the Democrats had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and by the time Obama ran for president, the Democratic Party got more. As you pointed out, one of the largest contributors to the Obama campaign was Goldman Sachs, and other investment firms, Archer Midland Daniels, but the price of this was that they had to betray the most basic values of the liberal establishment: a protection of the working class, protection of civil liberties. I mean, what has the Obama administration done? In essence, they have codified the destruction of international and domestic law put in place by the Bush administration. And that's not just in terms of permanent war or preemptive war. Preemptive war under the post-Nuremberg laws is a crime. It is defined as a criminal war of aggression. It's not just our offshore penal colonies where we openly torture people stripped of their rights, but it's also the refusal to restore habeas corpus. And I think this is very much the Clinton paradigm which Obama is serving. And yes, I'm as stunned as you are to see Bill Clinton resurrected as a friend of the average man and woman.
I was also surprised when Hillary Clinton was running, and in August of that year in Columbus in a debate with all the Democrats, she was talking about how she was a part of NAFTA and saw how good it was for the unions. And I'm thinking, I've done a lot of articles on that. It was devastating to the unions. Over 1.6 million American working people lost their jobs, and yet no one challenged her on that. And I was surprised. Only Dennis Kucinich had the courage to say he would revoke NAFTA. And I'm also looking at now Obama's in India. Did I miss something? Isn't India one of the largest countries in the world where we outsource our jobs, where hedge funds and equity partnerships are taking millions of American jobs, and 200 corporate executives have joined him on this trip? They're not there to open up new markets in America. They're there also to make deals of how they can take American companies, shift them over there, get special incentives so they can make a cheaper product and bring it back in the United States. And why isn't the mainstream media, even the Democratic media, talking about that part of this trip?
Well, I mean, let's bifurcate the media. We have the electronic media. I'm talking about the commercial electronic media, which doesn't even make a pretense of doing journalism anymore. It's all about celebrity gossip, these sort of long-running soap operas, whether it's John Edwards' Love Child or Tiger Woods' Mistress's sex tape, or, who knows what they've coughed up. And then we have the dying print media. The print media, for many decades, had a monopoly connecting buyers with sellers. They became very, very rich. I, of course, worked in the print media, including 15 years at the New York Times. That monopoly is gone. The buyers don't need newsprint to connect the sellers don't need newsprint to connect with buyers. And so what you've had within this withering newsprint establishment is a more craven acquiescence to corporate power. You can see it when you read the New York Times. As they lose circulation and they lose advertisers, they become more desperate to retain the loyalty of the moneyed elite, so that when you have lifestyle stories, for instance, in the New York Times, it's about that $30,000 a year kindergarten that you're trying to get your child into. Well, that's not your lifestyle. That's not mine. It's not the lifestyle of most Americans, but it is the lifestyle of that upper strata that advertisers want to reach, that their advertisers want to reach, and the paper wants to reach. And the result of this is that huge pockets or sections of the United States have become virtually invisible. I just did a story this week for The Nation magazine on Camden, New Jersey. I went with the graphic artist Joe Sacco, who did the drawings, and I did the reporting. Per capita, Camden is the poorest city in the country. It's also the most dangerous. And yet we don't see the desperation on the streets of these post-industrial pockets, whether it's in Michigan or whether it's in New Jersey or whether it's in the Deep South or anywhere else. And I think the media does that because for them they've long ago walked away from their calling as journalists who should give a voice to all segments of society, and transferred their efforts into the entertainment industry.
Earlier this year, I went to a very nice suburb in Florida. I was told that there were some homeless vets there, but when we're circling around trying to find them, I couldn't find them. And I went up and knocked on some doors. I said, they're homeless vets. Oh, yeah, they're here. Do you know where they're at? In the woods. Now, it turns out that in this suburban area, some wealthy man at some point bought some property, and he deemed it a natural preserve. Then when some homeless vets had no other place to go, and they went in there with their tents, and he said, okay, you can stay there. They had no water, no electricity. They had no way of finding, without a flashlight, their way in or out. But you couldn't see it from the road. So I walked in there, and about 100 yards in, I come to little pup tents, and here these guys, 3 and 4 to a little tent. 3 of the guys hadn't eaten in 4 days, no food at all. One guy had an operation 2 weeks before, had stents, and they were all infected. But he showed me he didn't have the money, $72 for his medicines. These were all vets. And so I began to say, how big is this? Just in that one area, there were 400. But then they said there's 16,000 around the central area of the state. So I spent time going in and photographing and filming these people and getting their story. And I sent this to every member of Congress, to the White House, to every one of the state legislators, over 5,000, to every governor, 7,000 members of the American media, over 1,000 activist celebrities like Will Smith, Sean Penn. Not one single response. I did a story that went with it, telling their story. And then I specifically called out Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly and Geraldo Rivera and Sean Hannity. You keep promoting war and how patriotic it is, and we should be behind our hero soldiers. Okay, let's say you're right. We should support our soldiers, even if we don't support the wars. Why aren't you supporting all these people now? There are 900,000 a year, homeless vets. And these were sleeping in the woods. Others are sleeping under railroad tracks. Why is it that this doesn't exist? So then I sent it to Keith Oberman and Rachel Maddow and all the people on the left and The Nation magazine. I sent them the documentary. And then I sent them 2 other documentaries called Gulf War Syndrome, Killing Our Own, and not a word. Then, so not only does the right not want to know about what's happening with, the people that they keep putting up as poster children to support, war, but when these people get sick from Gulf War Syndrome, or they're homeless and sick and living in pup tents in the woods, they don't want to have a thing to do with them. But also, I went back around to every one of those homes after I met these people, and I interviewed the people. I says, do you know how sick these people are? Well, it's not our problem. Do you support the war? Yes. Do you support the vets? Yes. But you don't support them when they're living in the woods behind your house? Well, no. I even found one. Do you know in Florida it's against the law for a homeless vet to stop and sit on a bench in a public park? They'll get a ticket. And one vet was sitting on a bench. He had to walk 4 miles to the employment. They go at 3 o'clock in the morning. Oh, by the way, it's a phenomenon. Every morning at 3 a.m., all these homeless vets go to their local employment office. But the moment they have to sign up and it shows they're a vet, they won't take them. And hundreds said they take everyone else ahead of us, even though we have more skills. And then they walk back. They don't have transportation. But if they stop in a park and just sit, they'll get a $40 ticket. So then the guy writes a little sign that says, "I'm a homeless vet, can you help me?" And this cop gives him another ticket for some form of, loitering. So now he's got $80. If he doesn't pay the $80 within a month, he's then arrested and he goes to jail. Were you aware of this?
Yeah, I did know that was a tactic that they use. Not necessarily for vets, but to get rid of homeless. That they drop all these tickets on them is essentially, it's a form of criminalizing poverty is what it is.
But why aren't the Democrats or the liberals talking about this? Oberman hadn't done a show on it. No one's talking about it.
Well, I can't say as I'm terribly surprised. I'm not a huge fan of these so-called left cable news shows like Oberman and Rachel Maddow, because they sing to the same script. They just give it a different spin. It's the same gossip. It's the same PR soundbite, released by the White House or released by Sarah Palin. It's a Punch and Judy show. At a time when we so desperately need a critique of what unfettered capitalism and the corporate state has done to us, you're not going to get that on Oberman or any of these shows. I think it's a kind of faux left. I don't think it's a real left. It triggers those sort of emotions of people who are outraged by the right without descending into a serious discussion of what's wrong. So in that sense, it doesn't affect or perturb the power elite at all, which is, of course, why they're still on the air and why corporate sponsors give them money.
Oberman did some outstanding commentaries, and I commend him for it when he was challenging Bush and Bush's wars. But now he doesn't do the same commentaries against Obama and Obama's wars, or rendition when it's Obama,
right,
or waterboarding when it's Obama, or habeas corpus not being restored when it's Obama, who's a constitutional lawyer and can't get away with the fact he didn't know. He taught 12 years, University of Chicago, constitutional law, as did his vice president teach constitutional law. How can we then not be equally challenging because they're a Democrat as we would have if they were a Republican?
Well, that's precisely the problem. We're not looking at the underlying structure. We're looking at the personalities and the personal narratives of the people who are the face of the structure. And until we grasp that our democracy has been taken from us, that what we have created is, in the words of the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, a system of inverted totalitarianism, by which Wolin means it's not classical totalitarianism, it's not built around a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but finds its expression in the anonymity of the corporate state. So that in classical totalitarian societies you have a revolutionary or a radical movement that tears down decaying structures and replaces it. In inverted totalitarianism, you have powerful corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to the Constitution, patriotism, electoral politics, and yet have so corrupted the levers of power that the citizenry is impotent. And I think that's true. And that is the kind of critique which you are not going to get on an Oberman or a Rachel Maddow, because they wouldn't last on the air.
And yet we have a large number of people who consider themselves, especially younger people, who consider themselves progressives because they watch Jon Stewart, and I don't see them out there demonstrating. I don't see any demonstrations against poverty, hunger in children, foreclosures of homes. If you had the same rate of foreclosures of homes and dispossessed people, 20 million, 5 million homes thus far closed, four people per home. That's 20 million. If you had that in France or England, oh, you'd have the government brought to its knees. I want to read this. This is from Steve Allman, published in the San Francisco Chronicle and given to Common Dreams. Quote, Jon Stewart, opiate of the masses. I realize it's going to put me in some pretty unsavory company, but here goes. I didn't like Jon Stewart's rousing speech at the end of his rally to restore sanity. I found it cowardly and even a little heartbreaking. I'll get to why in a minute, but let me say that first I've been, for many years, a big fan of Stewart and his evil twin, Stephen Colbert. They're both brilliant comedians, and when they choose, to be powerful advocates of reason. Stewart's systematic dismantling of insurance company shill Betsy McCaughey, what's her name? McCaughey, for instance, was a crucial bit of public theater that helped put to rest the myth of death panels. Colbert's upbraiding of both George Bush and the lapdog media that enabled him at the 2006 White House Correspondents Association dinner was a genuine act of heroism. So when Stewart and Colbert announced their joint rally, I was excited at the next dissatisfied progressive. The more cultural bandwidth these guys get, I figured, the more sensible our discourse will become. I was especially glad to see Stewart drop his wisecracking and deliver an earnest closing speech. His diagnosis of the modern media's perpetual panic conflict was spot on, as was his eloquent call for Americans to treat one another with civility. Rather than call to action, the crowd received a moment of transcendent self-congratulation. We all restored Jon Stewart's faith in us by gathering en masse and not calling for anyone to be slandered. It turns out that Stewart and Colbert don't really want citizens to do anything about the corruption of our media and political classes. They just want us to sit back and laugh at them as they mock this corruption, then high-fi ourselves for being so awesome. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that Stewart should have nothing to say overtly political. His obvious and understandable intention was to avoid being sucked into the conflict. The fact that he and Colbert have become our voices of conscience, of course, speaks to the larger moral vacuum in this country. In conclusion, but whether he likes it or not, and his speech was clear evidence that he likes it a good bit, Stewart is now a moral authority in this country, especially to young people, without getting the least bit partisan. He might have reminded the millions of people watching him that we are all shareholders in our democracy, not passive observers. That politics isn't just some big, ugly game played by cable TV. It's a set of agreements about how our country is going to function, one in which moral progress is made against considerable and generally well-funded resistance. In this sense, Stewart and Colbert have become the designated opiate of the left in this country. Every night they allow us to laugh at how bad things have gotten without actually doing anything about it. Their effect is ultimately of no consequence. The plutocrats and paid demagogues of the right learned long ago that their best chance at power resided not in crafting sensible, humane policy, but inciting the primal negative emotions of a troubled electorate. On Tuesday, that strategy paid off. Despite Stewart's feel-good benediction, they have now promised to fight Obama tooth and nail. In the coming weeks and months, the poor and the sick will probably become more poor and sick, as will the aggrieved and the cynical and the violent. Fear not, fellow citizens, Stewart and Colbert will be there to preside over the ruin with wit. Sure, the country went down in flames, but it went down laughing. Your thoughts, please.
Well, I agree. I look at Colbert and Stewart as serving the same function that the cabarets served in
Hitler's
Berlin, in Hitler's Berlin. Everybody laughed at the buffoonish Nazis and made fun of the Führer and all the way to Dachau. And I think that that we make a mistake. And remember that part of this rally, and he's right, I mean, it was insipid. It had all of the political content of a Boy Scout jamboree. Its primary message was, let's just all be nice to each other. But it also, coming out of the working class, I found somewhat offensive. It made fun of all the rubes and buffoons and people who hadn't managed to get to college because they had to get a job. That it exacerbates the class divide between this largely college-educated liberal elite, which still economically is in a position far above that of our dispossessed working class. And I think one of the great failures of the political landscape is that we have forgot that we should speak in the language of class war. And I think that's one of the failures of the anti-war movement, that the betrayal of the working class by supporting a Democratic Party that has made war on the working class is the reason that liberals not only have no traction, but is also the reason that liberals are a target of part of this rage. And I think that it's a legitimate rage, and I think the rage towards liberals is legitimate because of our hypocrisy. And Stewart and Colbert, as this article I think presciently pointed out, serve as a mechanism by which we can laugh away something that is deadly serious, and that is the rise of a lunatic fringe within the Republican Party that will dismantle what's left of government and social services. And remember, these people somehow have, through their twisted logic, convinced themselves that the military and the security and surveillance state are not part of the government, cannot be touched. So, yeah, I think that there's a kind of disempowering of the very class that should begin to find power by these comics.
You're listening to Chris Hedges. This is a continuation of our series on Conversations with Remarkable Minds. We are at halfway through our program. We will continue with him. And I'm asking Chris to comment on some of the other voices of progressives out there who are dissatisfied with what has happened to the liberal movement. And also there's confusion of what is a liberal today, a Democrat, and a progressive, and we will discuss that. And Chris Hedges will also be doing a lecture later on in a book signing tonight at Revolution Books at 9 West 19th Street. That's between 5th and 6th, starting at 8 p.m. So hopefully those of you who are in the area can go down there. He'll be doing a talk, a book talk, and you won't want to miss that. That's Revolution Books.
It's going to be at 40 East 35th Street, actually. They moved to the Community Church of New York at 7:30.
So, okay, 7:30. Please give that address again.
40 East 35th Street.
7:30. Good. We're talking about the collapse of the liberal class, and why should we care about the liberal class? Well, for a simple reason. Because historically the liberal class was the safety net. It was the group of people that you could call upon to help the workers, the middle class, the working class, the poor, the disenfranchised. They were the go-betweens of the government and corporate powers and tried to be the arbiters to see that they weren't exploited. Just think of America between 1945 and the mid-1970s and the quality of life, and look at it from that time till now. Chris, in discussing the problems on Wall Street, we do not hear about the power contributing to this mess of the equity buyout partnerships that have caused the displacement of over 25 million jobs in the last 30 years. And they are a majority of the companies representing America in this jaunt over to India. No one's even talked about that. Hedge funds. One hedge fund man made more money in 1 year than the DuPont family made in 25 years. And that's when the DuPonts were considered America's, along with Rockefeller, the two wealthiest families in America. And that's just considered normal. 25 hedge funds owners made $1 billion each last year. We don't look at the moral consequences of the decisions people we make. We only look at the political consequences, not even the legal consequences. And I want to tie one more ribbon on that. I think we've got it all wrong on home foreclosures by them not dotting the I's and crossing the T's and try to trivialize it. That's not where we should be focused, I believe. We should go back to how they originally packaged these and saw that they were not able to prove legal title to one institution and one individual at that time. That was a fraud. Therefore, that means that the vast majority of these loans given out were fraudulent. And I believe that if they start investigating how you go back, not to last week or last year, but go back to how they originated those, the fact that they lied, they falsified people's incomes, they did that. How, if you're going to falsify someone's income and falsify their background and their credit worthiness, and then you give them a loan based upon that, and then they can't pay it, how are you not equally culpable in that crime? Why aren't we willing to see that this is a massive fraudulent scheme? This whole bubble was created based upon fraud. Your thoughts, please.
Well, precisely. And that is, under any legal system, a crime. And these people should be in jail. They should at least be prosecuted, and they're not. Instead, they're receiving hundreds of billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. And talk about the media. I think there's an utter failure on the part of the media to explain that simple truth. The New York Times a few weeks ago broke that story on how the foreclosures themselves were based on fraudulent paperwork. And we stand by and do nothing. And I think that that is emblematic of how powerless we have become, that open crimes are committed in defiance of the wishes of the majority of Americans, and we can't affect them. We can't do anything to stop them.
When you look at many of the Tea Party movement, not all, but many, I went to multiple Tea Party events just to see who they were. I was tired of hearing Oberman tell me that they're all racist, and they're all nut jobs, and they're all redneck terrorists. So I wanted to see, is he right or wrong? And so I went to many, and I interviewed probably 1,200 people. I got a good random sampling of all. I did not find the majority were as dysfunctional or as hostile as he made out. I found that they were all concerned, but for different reasons. And a basic question I asked them, because many of them were former Democrats, I said, why are you here? And one person in particular, it sticks out in my mind, says, I don't necessarily want to be here because I'm sure that my anti-war positions and my corporate bailouts wouldn't mesh with a lot of people here. But why haven't the Democrats had a movement? Why haven't the progressive had a movement? Where can I go to voice my anger? And this woman who was 54 years old and now unemployed and losing her home and had only 1 month left and had two daughters, 14 and 16, had no child support and was too young for Social Security, had zero going for her. And she said, I voted for Democrat my whole life. I've been a part of these causes. I read The Nation magazine and The Reason and Progressive, and yet I don't see anyone out here showing me what you're going to do as a movement to help. We don't have anti-war movements, don't have anti-poverty. She says, now I'm a part of that anti-poverty movement. She says, this year, her and her daughters, in all likelihood, be at the kitchen that they donated for the last 16 years to give out turkeys. She will be there receiving the turkey. She says, do you know the kind of humiliation that creates when you go from giving to receiving? And she says, I don't know where we're going to sleep. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know the impact that's going to have on my daughters when they go back to school today. She says, but why in the dickens isn't someone doing something about it? And I heard that repeatedly. I'd like your thoughts on how we shouldn't make the mistake of lumping everyone who is angry and everyone who has an issue all together, as if by lumping them one size fits all, we can marginalize them and therefore not have to pay attention to any legitimacy in their arguments.
Well, not only is that true, but as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that disturbed me about the Colbert-Stewart rally is that we make fun of these people, and their suffering, as you correctly point out, is very real and very undeserved. And the failure of the liberal class is to recognize the legitimacy of that anger and that betrayal, and stand up and fight for the very liberal values and the liberal institutions which provided that safety valve. to redress wrongs. With the collapse of capitalism in the 1930s, we had mechanisms that brought us the New Deal and saved capitalism, as Conrad Black correctly points out. In the 1960s, with the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, we had mechanisms to redress the grievances of African Americans and the folly of the war in Vietnam. Well, now that mechanism is gone. There is no way, there is no channel that people such as the woman you mentioned can find redress within the system. And so they gravitate towards these fringe movements. And I have a great deal of empathy for the anger and a great deal of disgust for the liberal class and liberal institutions which have failed to respond. And yet...
Or mock them in the process.
And mock them, yeah. And but what worries me is that at its core, the Tea Party agenda is irrational. The idea that we're going to slash taxes and cut the deficit, the utter failure to confront the bloated defense industry, which consumes 50% of all discretionary spending. That's an untouchable element. And what we're going to be left with is a stripped-down state whose only sort of robust arm is internal and external security. And that's very, very frightening. And I think that what the attraction of this movement offers to people who have been abused in the way that this woman you mentioned has been abused is a kind of vent for their anger, an emotional consistency, a target which happens to be government. I mean, it's fascinating how the libertarian Ron Paul element has been really pushed aside quite consciously with corporate money. We saw with this great article in the New Yorker, and astute manipulation by people like Dick Armey, so that it's deflected attention from Wall Street and focused it on government and on the person of Barack Obama with, in some cases, what I find very disturbing racist undertones. And the liberal class has to wake up. We have to wake up, because if we don't defend these values, no one else will. And what is packaged within this rage is, of course, a rage at the liberal establishment and the liberal ethic, which we have failed to defend. So that you have Obama tagged not only as a liberal but as a socialist.
He's neither.
He's neither. But that becomes a very convenient way on the part of a very frightening right wing to discredit real liberals and real socialists. I mean, I am a socialist, and I voted, like you, for Ralph Nader. But it further diminishes the possibility of creating another dialogue.
I appreciate that answer. Thank you, Chris. Just a comment, if you would respond to it, please. At one of the Tea Party rallies in Philadelphia, there was almost an equal mixture of African Americans and whites and younger and older ones. And after hearing all the speeches, I went to start with a small group, and I said, could you offer me some challenges to my opinions? And they said, sure. So what became 5 or 10 people came about 50 people. And here's what I said. I said, are you aware that the very people that you're supporting are going to cause you more harm than what you have now? How so? I said, you're against all government. But it's two very important provisions that the government had in place that the Democrats took away with Republican help has caused the mess, the Glass-Steagall Act. Has anyone championed to get that back so we don't have this trading? Yet they were against Wall Street. I said, if you're against Wall Street, are you aware of how much control Wall Street has over the Republican Party and the wealthy oligarchs in our society, not just the Koch brothers, but on the left you had George Soros. You can't differentiate George Soros from these people. He makes his money, he made most of his money on trading in commodities that bankrupted Russians, bankrupted people in East Timor, and bankrupted as Latinos and Mexicans. And yet he was the darling, because and it made no sense. I said, but what if we did this? You say you're against socialism. All right, are you against the police department coming? Are you against the fire department coming? That's socialism. I went to a public school. How many people here go to public schools or have their children? All their hands went up. Are you against that? Should we close all public schools and just have private schools? And then I said, are you against the Coast Guard helping a ship that is tipped over, someone's lost at sea? You don't want us to do that? What if that person doesn't have a private insurance program under the Republican idea? What if someone watches a house burn down? Interesting, that would later happen. I said, would you like it if you had a fire in your house and your children were in the house and you called the fire department and they pulled up and says, sorry, you're not under our private payer program. We can't put out your fire. But my kids are there. They're burning to death. I know, but we're sorry. Well, don't be sorry. Help me. We can help you. If we had our old system, we could. There's a guy next door. He's beating up and mugging. We can't do that. He doesn't have that program. But he's going to come here next. Do you have it? No. Can't help you either. You mean you're going to sit there and watch crime being committed? Well, we wouldn't have in the past, but we have to now. And suddenly I could see lights going off. I said, so you've been thinking socialism was bad, yet you didn't look at the fact that most of our society is socialized. And I said, now, let's take a look at the other end of it. Do you want a smaller government? I agree. I want an effective government. I don't want bloated bureaucracies. I've come up with a chart. I showed him the chart. I said, how much does it take by any expert to really defend us from terrorists and make ourselves so nobody would attack us? $200 billion. We now have $1.1 trillion when you add in all offline and online. So that saves us approximately $900 billion. Subsidies to the large agri-pharma business, $350 billion. We could save that. None of that goes to small organic farmers. We could save the pharmaceutical industry, what we give them in subsidies through Medicare, Medicaid, and VA not being able to get the drugs at the lowest price. That saves us $300 billion. And we could have no-fault medical malpractice, where you put into our account, the doctors and hospitals, 1% of their income that pays for legitimate suffering, and so they don't have to do a defensive medicine. That saves us $200 billion. And then also look at the insurance industries. 33 cents out of every dollar that we spend of $2.6 trillion goes to the insurance companies, which is nothing more than profit. They're one of the most profitable industries in the world. So all told, if you just took socialism for the wealthy and you eliminated it, as you say you're for, you would save $2.4 trillion a year. Hence, look where you could put that money. Better schools, better education, infrastructure. And then, of course, that doesn't even deal with the wars. Do we need these wars? What are we going to get from it? What do you know about it? And once again, they didn't know. So when I said, show me where I'm wrong. If you want a smaller government, get rid of all this, because we don't need that. And they really didn't have those arguments. And I could see people thinking, but we don't have those dialogues. You don't have the so-called liberals, like Juan Williams. He's not a progressive. You know, he's an embarrassment, in my opinion. And yet, and as is Alan Colmes. We don't have, and I don't have anything against Alan. I think he's a decent fellow. But, boy, would I like to hear a different argument. All he's there to do is to defend the Democrats and Obama. He's not to look at what's really wrong. Your thoughts, please.
Well, that's what frightens me, that those people who have the capacity for moral autonomy and those people who make serious critiques of the system, and as you pointed out, the facts surrounding the for-profit healthcare industry are not disputable. It's the most inefficient, corrupt healthcare system in the industrialized world. But those facts have essentially been prevented from being disseminated to the American people by a corporate media and by turning the few figures, you mentioned Kucinich or Nader or others, who have been relentless about holding fast, I would say, to liberal values, turning them into figures of ridicule. And that's really what they've done to figures like Kucinich and Nader. It's not, they don't challenge their ideas because they can't. They turn them into jokes, which is what they did to my friend Jeremiah Wright. Very, very serious and thoughtful man. You know, they pull one clip and taken out of context and use it as a kind of incendiary indictment of a very serious Christian minister. And that has very effectively shut down the kinds of discussions that could have prevented the mess we're in. And the quote-unquote so-called liberal class, which I think we've done a pretty good job of exposing as hollow and inexistent, is completely complicitous in that, and they're rewarded for it. I mean, these figures make a lot of money. Look at a figure like Katie Couric. She's not a journalist. She makes $15 million a year posing as a journalist. They're celebrities. They are the faces of the corporate state. They have the capacity to exude a kind of false empathy and understanding, which makes them very credible and effective actors, but also very nefarious manipulators of public emotions, and are certainly deeply complicitous in this wall of deceit.
Two people I'd like for you to give your thoughts on. I watched what I consider the single worst display of arrogance in the media was when Bill Maher and Michael Moore got down their hands and knees begging Ralph Nader not to run because he couldn't win and he was going to lose it. And my thought at the time was, I said how appalled I was, because I said, take a look at this. Ralph Nader created 227 pieces of legislation, from the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, that were the law of the land. As not a legislator to do that, no human being before or after in American history has ever caused that many pieces of legislation that were pro-consumer. And yet, they're saying he is a dinosaur, he no longer is important. And I'm thinking if Ralph Nader were president, we wouldn't be in Iraq, we wouldn't be in Afghanistan, we wouldn't have had the bailout of Washington, because we wouldn't have had the evisceration of the Glass-Steagall Act. He would have stood strong on principle. He would have gone to the American public and he would have said, do you realize what's happening here? And he would have educated the public, as he did when he had that opportunity, and did so brilliantly. And I'm thinking, gee whiz, now I heard Bill Maher the other night, and he is lambasting people. He's being vile and crude, demeaning people who doesn't agree with him. And then I'm thinking, why can't Bill and Michael see that if they looked at what it means to be a progressive and not just a defender of the democratic values, that this election would have swung differently? We'd have different types of candidates. And yet that is what has happened if you stray away from the party line. If you're not a good Democrat, then you're fair game. I see the same people on Rachel Maddow, the same people on Ed's show, same people on. Though Radigan, I think, is a little different. I think he is. I think he's more capable of allowing people with different points of view on. Same people on Keith Olbermann. So I asked my audience, for 1 week, watch these shows and tell me if you remember anything that anyone said. It's vacuous.
Yeah, it's vacuous.
3.5-minute comments.
Yeah, and it's all around whatever the hot button issue of the day is. And Fox is just doing the same thing from a different angle.
Yeah,
you're right. It's completely vacuous. I spare myself the distress by not owning a television, so I don't have to watch this stuff.
Let's talk in the remaining 7 minutes we have. I'd like for you to talk about 4 areas that I'm concerned with. I would like your opinions on how so many Democrats have become kowtowing to the democratic principles, the Huffington Post among them, that I don't believe is progressive at all. And a lot of people calling themselves progressive that are not. Labor unions, universities, and religious institutions, and how they have refused to rise to the crisis in our society and to get people out and focus with constructive anger for constructive change.
Well, this is, of course, what I tried to go back and chronicle in this book, Death of the Liberal Class, where I went back to World War I. Because on the eve of World War I, we had powerful socialist, communist, progressive movements that had terrified the power elite in this country. And Woodrow Wilson used the war to break them. He created the most efficient and sophisticated system of mass propaganda in human history through the Creel Commission, crossing all sorts of mediums, not just newsprint, but graphic arts. If they had a film division, they had 45,000, they called them 3-minute men who fanned out across the country to sell the war to the public. And it was a fascinating moment and a terrifying moment in American history and in modern history, because it for the first time implemented the understanding that Le Bon and Freud and others had, Trotter, that people were not moved by fact and by reason and by rational argument, but could be manipulated by emotion to actually carry out all sorts of policies that not only were not in their interests, but in the case of the First World War, was tantamount to collective suicide of young working men in countries like Germany, France, and Great Britain, and finally the United States. And so that the actual measures of overt repression, which were taken against the few holdouts, people like Randolph Bourne or Jane Addams and others, was relatively few. And they essentially, at the end of World War I, we entered a new paradigm, which was the permanent war economy, constant fear. The hated Hun was replaced by the dreaded Red. And liberal institutions signed on for this. And they very ruthlessly purged their own, destroyed the Wobblies, destroyed the CIO. Well, who did it? Well, of course, those figures within liberal institutions who were the most morally bankrupt and the biggest careerists. We saw it within the universities. We saw a slight resurgence of the left in the 30s with the collapse of communism, and then ruthless witch hunts that extended into the 50s and 60s. And then we saw the rise of unfettered capitalism, globalization, which is a utopian ideology, the idea that the marketplace is going to determine human behavior. There's nothing in 3,000 years of economic history to justify this absurdity. And liberal institutions had been so denuded, so destroyed, that they lack the capacity for independent thought, lack the capacity to resist. So that we have now come down to this end point where the walls are falling down around us, and those who purport to defend liberal values, the gulf of their hypocrisy is just staggering, and I think increasingly not lost on the mass of American people. The very things that they claim to defend, they make war against. And Clinton is a perfect example of this, but so is Barack Obama. So are the heads of labor unions that spend all of their time negotiating away pensions and benefits and wages and rights for their workers. The press, we've talked about. Universities have been utterly corporatized. And so that the voices of sanity have been really pushed to the outer edges of society and lack the systems of mass communication by which to reach out to a confused and angry electorate.
Last question for you, Chris. Recently I saw this film based upon the founder of Facebook. And it did you see the film?
No, I read about it.
Okay. He is absolutely a horrible figure, and it shows him to be greedy, selfish, arrogant, hostile. And in fact, he lost all these lawsuits because he screwed people out of their royalties and whatnot. He lost it. At the end of the story, it showed that he lost these suits. And yet what was not discussed are all the people at Harvard who either were only interested in greed, not what they would learn to make it a better world, what they could do to make it a better world for themselves. Now, you've taught in these Ivy League schools. You've been in that environment.
I went to Harvard.
You went to Harvard. Tell us about what's gone wrong with the way that people use the institution, or the institution uses its students, how the alumni and benefactors have used these institutions. The average person doesn't understand any of this. All we've been told since John F. Kennedy is the best and brightest. And when you look at the wars, Vietnam, the best and brightest, and you look at all the other things we did, Panama, the best and brightest, And the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War, all the things, it's always the best and the bright. The economist, Larry Summers, president of Harvard. And then he brought in his former boss, Secretary of the Treasury, Rubin, who was president of CEO of Goldman Sachs, to be on the board of Harvard. So you're looking at the best and the brightest. And the average person is not stupid. And they're saying, hold on a second. Every single one of our major institutions are run by the best and the brightest. Where are we today? We're in free fall. Could you give us your analysis, please, of what it means to come with a mindset that you're the best and the brightest, or you're an institution to be a part of that gravy train of deferring to you because you graduated from this institution versus that?
Well, that's right. I mean, these institutions perpetuate the plutocracy. Human beings are mortal. Plutocracy lives forever. Larry Summers is the poster child for this, youngest tenured professor at Harvard in economics. Very brilliant in terms of a very narrow analytical intelligence with the maturity and common sense of a 12-year-old child. And you're right, he did put Robert Rubin on the Deputy Board of Overseers, and they gutted 50% of the Harvard endowment. So if they had just sort of trashed Harvard, maybe I could live with them. But then he went on to Washington, where he further trashed the American economy, continued the trashing of the American economy that he put in place in 1999 with the destruction of Gladstone.
And the Russian economy. It was Larry Summers who was one of the heads of the Economic Forum in that post-shock of taking people from pure communism for 67 years to capitalism.
Well, what it was is it was passing state enterprise into the hands of the Russian mafia. And I think that, as Karl Polanyi in The Great Transformation points out, that regulations are not only the bulwarks to protect the marketplace, but to protect democracy. And when those regulations are lifted, when you have unchecked and unfettered capitalism, you create a mafia political system and a mafia economic system where the industrious and the hardworking are wiped out, and the speculators, you mentioned Soros, speculators in the 17th century, by the way, were hung. It was considered a crime, a capital offense, walk away with billions of dollars, and the rest of us are thrust into poverty. So when you talk about the best and the brightest, they cloak themselves in these institutions and give themselves legitimacy through these institutions. But having attended these institutions, I would make sure and add as a scholarship student, and having seen it from the inside, you understand that what they are doing is empowering their own narrow elite at the expense of everyone else.
And that's why we are in no small measure where we are today.
And that's why we are, exactly.
Why can't we just get rid of all election campaigning that is private so that normal people, average people, could run for office?
Because then Exxon would lose the power that it has. The pharmaceuticals and Aetna, they would lose the power they have. The coal industry would lose the power it has. Raytheon, Halliburton, Northrop Grumman would lose the power they have. This is a perfect system that serves the interests of the corporate oligarchy. And if it destroys the country in the process, fine. If it destroys the planet in the process, fine. It's all about profit. I mean, these people have a very myopic and stunted vision of life. They've lost the capacity for the sacred. Everything is a commodity. Human beings are commodity. The natural worlds are commodities. And we exploit them until exhaustion or collapse. That's all they know how to do. They are in theological terms, they support systems of death, and they are individuals who are stunted, deformed, moral, and intellectual trolls. And Larry Summers is right up at the top of the list.
My guest, Chris Hedges. I'm Gary Null, which brings us to the conclusion of another program, this one on Conversations from Remarkable Mind, the death of the liberal class, a class that many of us had relied upon for so long to offer moral balance and guidance. One last thought. Nowhere in any medium in the United States today, left or right, conservative or liberal, are you hearing the discussion of Senate Bill 715, which would allow Monsanto and DuPont to virtually control all the food that is produced in the United States. It would be the end of freedom of choice, organic foods, and the specific language in the bill, 10 years in prison if you violate it, the ability to enter your house and to have no judicial review, to confiscate your bank account, to confiscate your personal property for something as simple as even possessing organic produce. Imagine how far we've come, and yet no one seems to think this is important. This is how we end up becoming more fascistic. I'm concerned. Contact your senator. Let them know no to Senate Bill 715. I look forward to sharing more with you at our 3 o'clock show. Have a nice day. Thank you very much, Chris Hedges.
Thanks, Gary.
There is a rose in Spanish Harlem.
The Gary Null Show is produced in our New York City studios. The producer is Richard Gale. The engineer is Matt Bogart. All shows are archived by Joe Kempf. Our chief archivist is Sharon Pride, and the program director is Carol Lee.
It's growing in the street right up through the concrete, but soft and sweet.
You're listening to the Progressive Radio Network, celebrating 5 years of independent points of view.
This is Glenn Ford. Join me and co-host Nellie Bailey every Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for Black Agenda Radio, an hour of news, analysis, and commentary from a black left perspective. That's Black Agenda Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.
Freedom News Hour will bring you up to date on the latest news on the financial meltdown.
Begin restoring local communities. It can happen.
We'll be exploring the issues from a freedom-oriented, small government perspective.
I'm Walt Thiessen.
I'm Melinda Pillsbury Foster.
I am Jake Town.
Join us live Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com.
This is a state of emergency. No, it's not. It's more of a state of urgency. I'm Danny Schechter. I'm your news dissector. I'm on the radio Fridays at 1 p.m. right here on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com, offering a different narrative to the news, challenging what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're reading, offering another way of understanding what's going on. Join me online on MediaChannel.org and join me here on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com Fridays at 1 p.m. Be there or be square.
Hello, everybody. This is Richard Martin of Richard Martin's Wake Up Call. I'm on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com twice a week on Mondays and Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to guide you and hold your hand through the worst economic catastrophe of all time. I predicted this right here on PRN back in 2005, along with the housing